Hi and welcome. So right now you're working on your rhetorical analyses. I'm going to do just a quick, reminder of what a rhetorical analysis entails. And at this point in the writing process, you have obviously read the arguments, Malcolm Harris's Feds and Candace Owens' Liberty University Convocation. And you have broken those arguments down, you've divided those arguments into the major rhetorical appeals. Ethos, pathos, and logos, emotional appeals, ethical appeals, and logical appeals. So what I want to do is, like I said, give you a quick refresher about what a rhetorical analysis is, and I want to review a little bit of your wonderful work that you've done dividing the arguments up into ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, so as a quick reminder, the purpose of a rhetorical analysis is to analyze an argument to figure out how it functions. How does it affect a particular audience? And you do that by adopting the role of an interpreter. You are essentially interpreting this argument for your readers. And you proceed by dividing an argument into its most significant parts, its most important ingredients, or rhetorical moves, which is, as I cannot stress enough, ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, pathos, and logos are the major components of any argument. So you are going to break an argument down into those main moves. And then you are going to show how well those components, those ethical appeals, emotional appeals, and logical appeals work together with external factors, with external constraints or conditions. In particular, the audience and the context surrounding an argument. In other words, given a particular audience and their expectations, their beliefs and wants and needs as a demographic, and given the context, the sort of status quo, the time and place in which this argument is being made, how effectively did those ingredients of ethos, pathos, and logos work to persuade that audience in that context? Um, and one important thing that I will note is that you do not need to agree with your argument in order to write a rhetorical analysis. So I am not by any means asking you to agree with one of the arguments, whether you write about Malcolm Harris or whether you write about Candace Owens. I am not asking you to agree with either of these arguments. And you shouldn't choose necessarily the argument that you agree with. So a very good rhetorical analysis will often disagree. A good rhetorical analysis will often argue that even though this argument might be effective for its intended audience, it's a poor argument. Or an argument that is going to have serious damaging effects. So oftentimes doing a rhetorical analysis is a really good way to understand how an argument is functioning in order to better challenge or argue against this argument. So ultimately, you might love this argument and you do a rhetorical analysis because you're incredibly persuaded and you think it's a very persuasive, good argument, and you want to figure out how they did that, how they achieved this. Or you might completely disagree with it and you want to figure out, you want to better understand why this argument is failing and why this is a bad argument. And sometimes it's a little bit of both. So sometimes there's parts of the argument that you really like, but you feel like it's being undercut or undermined by other parts of the argument. Or perhaps maybe you think this is a very effective argument. You think this is incredibly persuasive for the intended audience, but you think that it has some really damaging consequences as a side effect. So one example of that would be Malcolm Harris. So I think that this is a very compelling argument. There's a lot that I really like about this argument. But my thesis, when I write my rhetorical analysis, might be something along the lines of, even though it's incredibly well researched and a very persuasive articulation of the challenges facing millennials and Gen Z in the United States, um, it's potentially dangerous in the sense that it might be setting up a generational conflict, sort of generational war in some of its rhetorical moves that could be problematic, that could end up actually, making it harder for younger generations to improve their lives. Um, so that's an example where, you might agree, you might disagree, and it might be a little bit of both. And so we'll talk a bit more about the different types of claims that we can make. But the main thing I wanted to emphasize right now is that you do not need to agree with either of these arguments. That is not required for rhetorical analysis. Scrolling down to the section about the writing process, obviously you want to read the argument first, and so we've already finished this step. We've all read or watched both of the arguments. You're going to choose which argument you would like to write about, either Candace Owens's speech or Malcolm Harris's chapter. And then you're going to want to do some more research on the topic. So you're going to want to figure out who is the author, what are their credentials and background. Both of them have very interesting backgrounds. Candace Owens, in particular, is a very controversial speaker with a very mixed, difficult, challenging background. So it's very worth sort of getting a sense of what are their credentials, to what extent are they informed and authority about the subjects they're talking about, and what is their background, where are they coming from, what might be and based on that, do they have certain motives, what might be their ideological leanings, their biases, or their motives. Or to phrase that question a little bit more neutrally, what are their values, their beliefs, their needs and interests? Because we're all a little biased, and biased isn't necessarily a bad thing. To be biased simply means that, at its best, you have needs and interests and beliefs, and that's okay. But it's good to know that up front. It's good to know when you're analyzing an argument where that author is coming from. Who is the typical audience for that author? And it's important to know a bit about the context of the argument. Where is it happening? For example, Candace Owens, her context in terms of place is Temple University, which is a very conservative, evangelical university, which definitely is an important context for giving the speech and definitely influences some of the decisions that she's going to make. What preceded or provoked the argument? Obviously, police violence and the Black Lives Matter in response to that violence is a major, definitely is important context for both Malcolm Harris and Candace Owens. That definitely sparked and preceded and provoked both of their arguments. And how well have others responded to it? So if other people have responded, written analyses, written reactions to their arguments, it's good to be informed of those. What is the possible impact and the deeper implications of this argument on society? Who's a significant decision maker for the topic? And then you're going to formulate a claim and a thesis. And to do this, it's important to understand what is the major claim of the argument. So what are these arguments trying to achieve? What is their main claim? And what major reasons and evidence are they presenting in support of it? And then as well as that, once you sort of identified what the major claim is, then it's very important to do what we did for writing exercise number 6, breaking that argument down into its main ingredients of ethos, pathos, and logos. So identifying the major, the most important, the most impactful rhetorical appeals. So now we are going to look at what all of you submitted and identified as the major rhetorical appeals. So I'm going to direct you to this Google Doc that I made, which I'll be sharing with all of you. I've organized it by first section, ethical appeals in Owens Liberty University Convocation, logical appeals in Owens's Liberty University Convocation, and emotional appeals in Owens's Liberty University Convocation. And then we've got ethical appeals in Harris's feds, logical appeals in Harris's feds, and emotional appeals in Harris's feds. But before we look at those, let's start by just doing a quick overview of their major claims, just because to really understand these appeals and what they're trying to do, we probably need to have we need to clarify what we think their main purpose is. So I'm going to ask all of you guys to don't copy my work, say this in your own words, and you might disagree about what their main claim is. You might interpret their main claim differently from me, and that's okay. So definitely don't plagiarize this. If not, either you might have a different main claim that you identify in their arguments, but certainly write it differently in your own words. But I would interpret Harris's main claim as the role of the United States government in its young citizens' lives has changed significantly over the last couple of decades, from one that is supportive and benevolent to one that is predatory, in his own words, and damaging. Owen's main claim is that young Americans should not think of themselves as victims because bad things happen to them. She criticizes Black Lives Matter and other protests against systemic racism, the pro-choice movement, and welfare programs as major examples of what she calls a, quote, victim mentality. So you might notice that these arguments are very opposed to one another, and that's why I chose them. So these are very different takes. So Harris is seeing, the government. Basically, Harris is seeing young Americans as victims of a predatory United States government. Whereas Owens is arguing that young Americans should not think of themselves as victims. So they're very much opposed, which makes this interesting. Let's look at some of the rhetorical moves that you all identified as ethical appeals in Owens's Liberty University convocation. And just as a reminder, ethical appeals are appeals that speak to or appeal to the speaker's character. The most important types of ethical appeals are ones that emphasize the speaker's credibility. So if you're going to have good character as a speaker, it's helpful. You want to come across as knowledgeable, as well-informed. So it's important that people know, your readers get the sense that you know what you're talking about. You also want to come across as, you want to have goodwill, right? You want to come across as someone who is honest and a good person, right? And the third one is relatability. So it's extremely effective if you can get your audience to identify with you. So you want your audience to feel as though you guys have similar interests, backgrounds, beliefs, attitudes, that you want them to see a little bit of themselves in you. That's going to go a long way. So let's look at how Candace Owens tries to achieve this. Maximo noticed that she used the phrase, very indignantly, she told the story about receiving these hate mail, what I would call racist death threats over voicemail. And very forcefully, she noted how they called her a victim. And Maximo correctly stated that this 4-word phrase is an ethical appeal. She generates credibility by proving that she was labeled a victim, and she also generates substance for her argument by introducing a topic that she has personal ties to and can argue. So absolutely, I wrote that this is definitely an example of an ethical appeal. Because a major example of an ethical appeal is showing that you as a writer have firsthand experience and firsthand knowledge with the topic. So one way of showing your credibility and that you're informed is that you have a personal experience and a personal you have a personal stake in the matter, or have had personal experience with it. So by telling her story of being labeled a victim and how that hurt her, how that was damaging to her, that definitely is a form of ethos. And an interesting question would be, does Owens undermine that ethos by later framing conservatives, in particular white men, as victims of a liberal media?